Welcome to the Aeon podcast, where the light of Gnosis destroys all ignorance, and what you thought you knew, you didn't.
I was granted a grand vision. Men have always sought control. Control over land, over wealth, over power and resources, and the lives of lesser men. Holy Aeon, the priest of inner sanctuaries, brought forth to me a black and Stygian dream. He granted me a vision that I might wrest away the domain of God. He gave me power over life and death itself. We fought for eons in a land which knows no time, and as we did, he whispered to me the forbidden secrets of creation. My limbs were torn asunder in accordance with the rule of harmony. The skin was stripped from my skull in deference to Elijah, and as Lord Aeon set my flesh aflame, I perceived that I had transcended the mortal coil and become pure spirit. Is not this the composition of the waters? This was the first of many visions I received. Lord Aeon had taught me how, through the binding of flesh, spiritual essence and base elements, I could bring back that which had died. I could create new beings, neither living nor dead. Through these homunculi, I could wrest control away of the one realm as yet untouched by man, the afterlife. But Lord Aeon did not grant these visions to me alone.
Hey folks, it's Alex here at the Aeon podcast number 7, and today with my special guest. His name is Dr. Fraser. He is the professor and scholar at the University of King's College, I believe it's in Canada, at the History of Science and Technology program, or I should say, or a sub-college. Is that correct, Kyle?
History of Science and Technology program at the University of King's College.
Okay, great.
Yeah, let's go to Canada. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and you also specialize in a lot of stuff that I've been researching for a while now. Everything from Greco-Egyptian alchemy, the magical papyri, Gnosticism, Hermetism, a little bit of the Bible here and there. It's all pretty fascinating, and that's something I've been researching on my own. But yeah, so how you doing today, Kyle?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have been reading. I read a few of your papers back in the day. Well, not back in the day. A couple years back, I read your paper on Zosimos of Panopolis, which is the subject of our conversation. And a lot of what he talks about in his writings just dovetails in just so many areas. It's like it kind of boggles the mind. Everything from comparative religion, alchemy, of course, Gnosticism, Hermetism. You name it. I guess for our audience, we can just start off talking about that. But who is Zosimos of Panopolis, and what is his legacy in alchemy or Gnosticism or all that stuff? Let's
dive into it. Yeah, so Zosimos of Panopolis is the first historically identifiable alchemist of whom we know any biographical details.
Mm-hmm.
So we think he was working somewhere around 300 CE. Panopolis is in modern day Acme in Upper Egypt, just northeast of Nag Hammadi.
Okay.
And Panopolis is in the region of Thebes, the wider vicinity of Thebes. So Zosimos exemplifies the kind of syncretic learning is characteristic of the late ancient mind. Gareth Foden, in his book The Egyptian Hermes, spends a lot of time on Zosimos as a kind of exemplar of late antique syncretism. He developed a spiritual interpretation of alchemical practices. Really could be seen as the founder of spiritual alchemy. And according to that spiritual interpretation, the chemical processes enacted in the alchemical vessel mirror an internal Gnostic transformation of it. And his works are very interesting for that visionary side of alchemy. His so-called visions, probably his most famous surviving work. But also he was a technician, so he was actively engaged in the empirical side of laboratory practice. He gives us a lot of information about earlier alchemists like Maria, the Jewish alchemist Maria, who he credits with the invention of the distillatory apparatus and a circulatory device called the karotachus, in which metals were decomposed and reconstituted. So his works are extremely important both for the technical understanding of Greco-Egyptian alchemy and for the spiritual interpretation, which draws on both Hermetic spiritual principles and Sethian Gnostic spirituality. As I mentioned, Panopolis is just northeast of Nag Hammadi, where in 1945 the Coptic Gnostic codices were unearthed. And we see a very significant influence of that kind of Gnosticism in the surviving works of Zosimos. So a very imaginative synthesis of pagan Hermetic and Judeo-Christian Gnostic ideas.
And Zosimos, he talks about so many things, like for example, like in the letter of Omega, he talks about Adam, or the Genesis myth, being sort of similar to like Egyptian myth and also Greek myth in a lot of ways. Like he talks about how Adam was somehow similar to Thoth or Thoth Hermes, and then he also talks about how Pandora is the same as Eve, because Eve is of course known as the mother of all, the mother of the living, and then Pandora is also known as the all begetter or the all giver or something like that, because Pan means all, the all.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, just so much of Zosimos. I mean, what we get from occultism and alchemy can be traced back to this guy. I believe he even talks about he's also pretty much of a Hermetic alchemist, really. Because he's very. Yeah, he talks about Hermes in such a way that he's almost like the central character of his work. But I mean, you can go ahead. You can go elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's on the letter Omega, he says that the Egyptians identify the primal human as Thoth, whereas the Jews name him Adam. Greek Prometheus. All just cultural variants of that same primal principle of humanity that has become entrapped in the material universe. And it's interesting that he equates Thoth with the primal human, who, of course, Thoth is the Egyptian origin of Hermes Trismegistus. Right, so I think the notion here is that Hermes is a kind of logos principle, the Word of God, a kind of Christ principle, who Zosimos identifies with the human, in its primal form. And this light principle, through a fall, and the way he describes this fall is definitely in keeping with the Sethian Gnostic myth of the Anthropos. This light principle falls into matter, splinters into fragments, and then he describes also later on how Christ comes from the upper heaven, descends into our world to recollect those light sparks. So, I mean, just this bewildering synthesis of Greek mythology, the Jewish account in Genesis of the creation of the human, Egyptian religious principles, and a kind of weird Christianity, right? Definitely, he sees himself as a kind of Christian.
It's almost like he anticipated the later Theosophists that would come like thousands of years later. You know, like he synthesizes so many different traditions into one milieu or one corpus, right?
Yes.
And how he sees also Jesus is also pretty interesting, because Jesus in Zosimos' writings, he's almost like he's like a sort of like this font of light who was sent by this higher god, but he also describes him in a kind of a docetic way, because in Docetism or Docetism basically is the idea that Jesus was just a divine being sent from God, his son basically, but he took on the form of a man rather than being an actual man. He's like, or sort of like a semblance of a body, but it wasn't really a human body. But what's funny, the Catholic Church really pretty much condemned this as a heresy. But what's funny though, if you read Paul's writings, like in Philippians, he seems to also have this idea. He actually agrees with this idea. He says that Jesus came in the form of a man. Like, why say a form of a man? Why can't you just say he's a man? So right. Like, or the Son of God. Like, he took on the form of a servant or a slave, basically, and he was hung on a tree. So that's that whole idea, I think, is you can really find that in Paul's writings. And now, if you look at there's a church father, his name is Irenaeus. He says that all these Gnostic heresies came from Simon the magician, Simon Magus. But the way he describes Simon is that he was actually an incarnation of Jesus. So and then the way Simon describes the Trinity, like how he appeared to the Jews as a son, or to Samaritans as the Holy Ghost, or the Gentiles as God the Father, or something like that. But it's just kind of funny that Simon's also teaching the very same thing. But anyway, what's your opinion on all that? Like, what's your opinion on Jesus, and how does Zosimos see Jesus?
Yeah, I think he's definitely following the Sethian Gnostic interpretation of Jesus, which, as you say, is a docetic interpretation. I think what's most interesting there on the letter Omega is that he basically equates the Christ principle with the primal anthropos. Right? So essentially, Christ is returning to recollect himself, right? His lost light sparks, which have become dispersed throughout matter. So as in certain currents of the Gnostic tradition, Christ is seen as the twin of humanity, or as the innermost spiritual spark of the human as such. So then, this is definitely not Nicene Christianity, right? We're not dealing here with the Word made flesh, and also there is a blurring of the distinction between the human and God, which is really part of the more pantheistic approach, the emanationist approach of the Gnostics, and really quite different from the understanding of God's relation to creation in Nicene Christianity.
Right, and if you look at the Hermetica, says that the Anthropos, he descended into matter and became nature. What's funny though is if you look how they describe the Anthropos, he's like the brother of the Demiurge in a way. He's like, it's just kind of funny. But the Demiurge in the Hermetica isn't this bad, bumbling, fallen, blind, insane, demented god that you see in Sethian Gnosticism. So how does Zosimos treat the Demiurge? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So from Zosimos' point of view, what he calls the Jewish tradition, which is basically Gnosticism, right? When he talks about the Jewish tradition, he's talking about this esoteric form, Jewish Gnosticism, which he thinks is essentially harmonious with the Hermetic tradition. So from his point of view, they're just different historical expressions of one unchanging esoteric tradition. But of course, when we look at these traditions from a historical point of view, we see differences. We see similarities for sure, but as you've noted, the Sethian Gnostic tradition is anti-cosmic, whereas the Hermetic tradition is pantheistic and pro-cosmic ultimately. But even within the Hermetica, we detect anti-cosmic moments, which are ultimately transcendent. Right, so when we're in the Hermetica, when we're talking about the soul's entanglement in matter as a kind of crisis that has to be overcome, in those moments, the universe is often described in quite negative terms. So matter is seen as the tomb of the soul, as something that has to be overcome. But then, as the initiatory process unfolds in the Hermetica, and we begin to liberate ourselves from captivity within the sublunar universe, then the descriptions of the cosmos tend to become pro-cosmic. So in the Hermetica, the attitude towards the physical universe shifts depending on where we are in the initiatory process. Whereas for the Sethian Gnostics, I think it's just true in a kind of metaphysical sense that the universe is fallen, right? That there is a rupture within the divine world itself, and it's a difficult question whether this world can ever be redeemed, or in what sense it can be redeemed. And I think different strains of Gnosticism have different answers to that question about the redemption of the universe. From an alchemical point of view, I think Zosimos believes that there's a twofold process in alchemy. Right? First, there is the destruction of nature. The metals are disintegrated and transformed into prime matter. But then there is the reconstitution of nature. Right? That prime matter is molded into the precious metals. So that duality within alchemy, I think that reflects that reflects the shifting attitudes towards the physical universe itself. Right? We begin with a kind of negative sense of matter as something that has to be deconstructed, but then we shift to a more positive sense of matter as a principle that can be redeemed. So I think that's how Zosimos is able to creatively unify these two traditions, which seem to have different evaluations of embodied life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I believe in visions. Zosimos is talking about how, I don't know if it's himself that's killed by some priest, but I think it's him. But but his body is sacrificed in some really ghastly fashion.
Yeah.
And but then he's reborn in spirit, right?
Right.
Yeah. And and the way they describe this process of the there's descent into hell or Hades, is like kind of the same idea of like the Negretto state.
Yes.
And then but out of that somehow you're reborn as a new creature, and then it was like from matter to spirit. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So in later alchemy, solve et coagula, right? Dissolve and synthesize. fundamental dialectic that defines alchemy from the very beginning. In Greco-Egyptian alchemy, it was encapsulated by the so-called maxim of Ostones, Persian Magus Ostones. Nature rejoices in nature, nature conquers nature. And the visual depiction of that duality is the Ouroboros, the self-consuming serpent, which both dissolves and consumes itself and then reconstitutes itself endlessly. And that process, that fundamental dialectic of alchemy, is a kind of participation in the cosmogonic unfolding of God, right? As God disintegrates into the plurality of created things and then returns once again to its primal unity, right? So the Ouroboros is a kind of, is at once an image of the alchemical work and of this greater drama of divine death and resurrection, right? Which provides the paradigm for initiation in the spiritual alchemy. That's awesome. So yeah, there's all this imagery of flaying and blood sacrifice in the visions. This magnificent image of a serpent that guards a temple, right? And we have to slay the serpent, we have to break it down, and then we have to turn it into a staircase that will allow us to ascend back to the heavenly temple. So all these magnificent images, which are all gesturing towards this fundamental dialectic.
Right, and I think he also alludes to this bowl of Hermes, and how you're supposed, when you're baptized in this bowl somehow, the bowl of nous or the bowl of mind, and somehow you're reborn from that. It kind of sounds like the Holy Grail, if you think about it. I mean, yeah, it's like, the Holy Grail's a cup, right? And we actually get into this in great detail in the that Baphomet book I talked to you about earlier, that I co-wrote with Tracy. But go ahead, you can elaborate on that.
Yeah. So there is a Hermetic text called the Creator or the Monad. That describes initiation as a baptism in mind, as you said. And that idea also features in some of the Sethian Gnostic texts. So both the Hermetic tradition and the Gnostic tradition conceived of initiation as an interior baptism, right? We baptize ourselves in the waters of the intelligible world, and we purify ourselves of our material attachments. And that baptism in mind was coupled with a visionary ascent. So as you were cleansed of matter, that was visualized as an ascension through the heavenly spheres, beyond the universe into the Ogdode, the eighth. Yeah. So that it's very interesting. Zosimos discovers that idea of a baptism in mind in the Hermetic texts, and I think in his Gnostic sources, and then weaves it into an alchemical allegory, where the crater becomes not only the baptismal font, but the alchemical vessel in which the metals are disintegrated and reborn. So it's really quite an ingenious appropriation of that image of noetic baptism. So he references the crater both in the visions, and again in a work called The Final Quittance. So he's definitely read that Hermetic tractate. That shows us that some of the Hermetic works in our Byzantine collection were being read already by Zosimos around 300 CE. He also references Poimandres, the first. He calls the supreme god Poimandres, which is an allusion to that first tractate in the surviving Hermetic collection.
Yeah, and I have so many things to say about that. I mean, first of all, let's just go back to the whole idea of the visions. Like, so you have the priest, who I think he sacrifices himself. I think, or is it? I get confused, but somebody gets sacrificed and then they're reborn of a spirit.
Priest named Aeon.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Aeon. That's right. He says he was sacrificed and flayed.
Okay.
And burnt in the furnace. Yeah.
Yeah, and that reminds me of how Dionysius was also dismembered by the Titans, right?
Right.
And then his divine essence is like scattered throughout the universe, but
Yes.
humanity was like born from the divine essence of Dionysus and the infernal elements of the Titans, because Zeus was enraged, so he poured his wrath on the Titans, and then
Yes.
he destroyed them.
This is an interesting piece. So Carl Jung wrote an essay on the visions of Zosimos, a pretty controversial essay. So historians of science tend to have issues with Jung's archetypal approach to the materials. But one thing that he noted that is hard to dispute is the parallels between the kind of initiation that Zosimos describes and shamanic initiations. And here Jung and Eliade are kind of in sync. So if you look at records of initiations in the Siberian context, Eurasian shamanism, but also in the Amazonian context, and in some of the Greek myths that you mentioned as well, right, in reference to Orpheus,
Right.
which may be connected to that Siberian context ultimately through Thrace, right? What they all have in common, transculturally, is this idea of dismemberment, right? That the shaman experience is a dismemberment, a physiological. His body is completely broken down by the spirits and then reconstituted, and the body that is reconstituted is some kind of spiritual body that has been transformed in certain fundamental ways. So shamans will describe how precious stones are implanted in the body in certain places. These are all sort of images gesturing towards some kind of occult physiology that has taken shape within the shaman, that allows him to function as a conduit for divine energy. So it's fascinating to me that we see a very similar pattern of initiatory death and resurrection here in Zosimos, who obviously knows nothing about these other cultural traditions. So what it means, that's a very difficult question, right, to figure out what those parallels mean. If we can't account for them in terms of direct cultural or even indirect cultural influence in some cases.
Yeah, and if you look at the life of Jesus, even in the Gospels, he's sent by God. And then John the Baptist is the one who he's the preparer of the way for Jesus to enter into the world, to descend into the world. Then he does all these miracles, and he has all the disciples follow him. He tells all the disciples to give up everything and follow him. And I guess towards the end, I think on all four Gospels, he's crucified and he dies and he resurrects. Now, also, if you look at, I believe it was a text called the Acts of Pilate, I believe, but in that text, Jesus descends into Hades, and he actually talks to, Hades, the devil, all the condemned souls, and Tartaros, and then he takes them back up. Now Marcion, I'm sure you know who he is. He has a different take on that. He says that since Christ was sent by a higher God, by the good God, and that the lawgiver was Jehovah, so all the patriarchs of the Old Testament were in hell, but somehow they think they were being tested by Jehovah somehow, but they rejected Jesus, and they're stuck and languishing in torment or something. And but while all the sinners, like Korah or Cain or Balaam, they go with Jesus. It's kind of funny. So the church fathers have they say that Marcion kind of inverts things around, and the same thing happens with the Sethians too. They have a tendency to invert the stories of the Bible and the Old Testament.
Yes.
Right. So, does Zosimos do a similar thing with his work, or does he follow that tradition, or what do you think?
So we don't see the kind of overt antinomianism
Mm-hmm.
That we find in some of the more extreme Sethian readings, right?
Right.
Where the hidden meaning of the Torah is actually the reverse of its literal meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of the most extreme type of esoteric hermeneutics that we see with the Gnostics. Zosimos doesn't tend to go quite that far.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because he's not really invested in a notion of the universe as irredeemable, right? So, in other words, his thinking ultimately is not dualistic, but monistic.
Mm.
And really, the more antinomian threads of Gnosticism tend to be dualistic and fundamental, right? So you have the good guys and the bad guys.
Right.
There are dualistic moments in Zosimos, but ultimately, the work of alchemy aims to overcome duality, to bring about some kind of final synthesis or redemption of matter.
Yeah, and going back to what you said about being cleansed of matter to ascend to spheres. So I had a dream. This is maybe a year ago. It was a pretty intense dream. I had a vision of, I think, a dream vision of Jesus. He said that that God sent his son to wash people clean.
Right.
So that goes with the whole idea of being baptized in the Holy Ghost, or being baptized from the torments of matter, or the punishment of matter. You know how the Hermetica goes into that. So ever since then, I just had this idea, baptism. I don't know, baptized in knowledge. I've just been on this thread of just this whole idea of being baptized and being, so I think even Gnosticism, they have their own version of the original sin, quote unquote. They call it the counterfeit spirit, and I think Zosimos goes into that. So yeah, so you can elaborate on that.
He does mention in On the Letter Omega a counterfeit spirit that is set against the Christ principle. So this is one of those dualistic moments in his presentation where we probably detect some kind of Sethian Gnostic influence. So this counterfeit spirit aims at keeping those light sparks of Christ enslaved in matter. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some other alchemical texts from the Greco-Egyptian period, one attributed to Comarius, that talk about the darkened spirit, full of vanity. Right? There's this idea, there's this notion that there's some kind of cosmogonic principle that aims at keeping the divine principle asleep and enslaved. Now, whether that corresponds possibly to the Gnostic demiurge, right? It's really unclear in the way that Zosimos elaborates it. It's a very brief passage. But we see similar accounts, for example, in Plutarch. In the Platonic tradition, he talks about two demiurges. Right? You have the good demiurge, and then you have this counter demiurge figure. It's very strange. So, it's difficult to know what to make of that. Is that simply a way of describing these two moments in the divine unfolding, right? So that you have, even Plotinus describes the world soul as having these two aspects to it, right? There's the aspect of the world soul that is inward turning and transcendent and that wants to hold itself together in purity. But then there's the world soul that is outward directed, that is entangled in time and space and matter. Right? So that dialectical movement is within the divine principle itself. And I think the question is, do we want to think of that second moment that as somehow metaphysically evil, or as involving a corruption of some kind? Or can we hold that second moment within the greater activity of the divine as simply a moment to be transcendent? And I think it's unclear what Zosimos thinks on that.
Yeah, and then it's interesting you mentioned the good demiurge and the bad demiurge. I mean, it almost sounds like Zoroastrian in a way, Like you have Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, but it seems like all this stuff really came from the Chaldeans. I mean, I know Zosimos talks about the Chaldeans, and of course, there's also the Chaldean oracles, and I talk a little bit about that on my website. But I mean, is there any connection between Zosimos and the Chaldean oracles? Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a collection of texts. I believe it's from, I think, well, it's attributed to Zoroaster, but a lot of these texts have very interesting connections with Gnosticism, particularly Ophide Gnosticism, but because they also talk about Hecate, and how Hecate is like some kind of a chthonic goddess. Now, is there, like, what's your opinion on the Chaldean oracles? Now, I don't know why I talk about that, but it just popped in my head. So, what's your opinion on that?
Well, the Chaldean oracles certainly are an important thread in later Platonism.
Mm-hmm.
So they're very important for the tradition of Iamblichus and Proclus, representing one thread of the esoteric tradition, right, along with the Hermetic texts. Now, Zosimos, I can't recall any allusions to the Chaldean oracles in Zosimos himself.
Mm-hmm.
He, in terms of Persian elements, I mentioned Plutarch and the two demiurges. Scholars have sometimes wondered whether there might be some influence of Zoroastrianism indirectly that somehow filtered into later Platonism.
Yeah.
That may have reinforced a more dualistic perspective in some of the texts. It's hard to say. There were works circulating in the Greek world attributed to Zoroaster and figures like Ostones, the Persian magus Ostones, works of magic and alchemy. But those works seem to have little connection to the Persian religion itself. Right? They seem more to be kind of romanticized adaptations, maybe with loosely Persian themes in some cases. Zosimos does refer to Zoroaster. He couples him with Hermes at one point, and I think he's referring to this kind of pseudonymous pseudo-Zoroastrian occult literature that was circulating at the time.
Yeah, and then I think there's like some Sethian texts that talk about Zoroaster for sure. Like the Apocryphon of John talks about the Book of Zoroaster with all the different body parts corresponding to different spirits that created them or somehow possessed them. That we're all made of evil spirits, or somehow we all have these demons inside us or something. But somehow, but in my opinion though. Those texts are really made for magical purposes. I don't think they're really meant to be read as like a liturgy or something like to be inspired, like it's like to read from a church necessarily, like how in the case of like the Marcionites or the Valentinians. I mean, they're more Christian in that sense, but I don't think they're really doing all these magical rituals like the Sethians were. So I think all these texts really are more of a magical persuasion. So, I mean, but of course, but yeah, that's a subject I actually want to get into now. So what's your opinion on magic, and how does Zosimos influence magic, and is there any connection between religion and magic? Is there any difference?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So in the letter Omega, he makes one pejorative reference to magic, where he seems to characterize magic as an attempt to do violence against fate, an attempt to coerce or manipulate fate, which he represents as something bad, right? So the notion there seems to be that alchemy, rather than resisting the natural flow of things or trying to magically coerce it, is participating in the unfolding of nature itself. So this idea that alchemy imitates nature rather than attempting to surpass nature. So that's the one reference to magic. explicitly in Zosimos that I can think of, and it's a negative one. At the same time, he certainly doesn't think we should be mindlessly following fate, right? Because then we remain trapped within matter.
Mm-hmm.
But the way to escape fate is not through magical coercion, but rather through entering into the inner logic of the universe itself, which will naturally elevate us back to our primal source, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So magic, the question of, and of course, when we talk about magic, the word magic itself, in ancient contexts, as in modern contexts, it's an evaluative concept, right? It's not an empirical term, right? To call someone's practices magical is often an accusation, right? So magic is a kind of polemical term, and Zosimos uses it that way as well, right? Magic is something bad, it's something irreligious. So it's quite interesting to note that in this period, in the early centuries of the Common Era, we already see a developing dichotomy between magic as something coercive and illicit, and religion as something pure, right? So that dualism is already beginning to come to light in the Roman imperial period and in the late Antique period.
And I believe a lot of the Roman, actually the Roman state, really. I mean, they describe all these Christian groups as they're these magical sects that they engage in all these diabolical rites. And I think it's actually Celsus who actually says that these Ophite Christians they're involved in all these unseemly dark magical rituals and all this cannibalism and eating babies or whatnot and orgies, all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of funny, like everyone accuses everyone else of doing the same thing, right?
That's right. Yeah.
The church fathers say the same thing about the Gnostics. Epiphanius says, these Gnostics, they had this orgy and then they sacrificed a baby. And they ate the aborted fetus, and they sacrificed it to the Archon of Lust, or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, but what's your opinion on that? I know we talked about it a little bit earlier, but go ahead.
Yeah. So, charges of blood libel, neighboring accusations, cannibalism, blood sacrifice, profanation of the sacraments with sexual fluids or excrement. These are typical charges that we see leveled against different religious groups in different contexts. In the case of the Gnostics, there is a kind of anti-natalism. It's characteristic of some of the Sethian texts, right? So this idea that reproduction is a kind of perpetuation of our enslavement in the physical cosmos. And it may well be that there were certain sacramental rites that might have looked, in the eyes of more orthodox, the developing orthodoxy, that might have looked as though they were reversals of some kind of their own sacramental practices. So when you hear charges about, sacrificing babies, right? You can imagine that, maybe in the distance there is some kind of memory of an anti-natalism, right? A kind of negative view. And how was that expressed sacramentally, right? That's the question. And we really don't know much about the sacramental practices of the Gnostics, because most of what we hear is through the distorted lens of the Catholic Christians. Mm-hmm. So there might be like a germ of truth underlying these weird stories, right? But it's difficult to know what exactly, where exactly the boundaries are, I think.
Yeah, but it's just so funny, if you look at, I kind of doubt all that really happened. I think, if you look at the Middle Ages, though, if you look at that, a lot of the, there are Catholic texts that actually have monks actually recited hymns to Satan. So it's kind of funny that the Catholics were also involved in that kind of magical ideas. But when you look at the Gnostics, though, they the same. Yeah, like you can accuse them of all that kind of stuff, but at the same time, like, I mean, because a lot of their ideas to say, like, they believe that you're supposed to ingest, like the spark of life, and you're supposed to release it back into the universe, and the Manichaeans kind of believe the same basic idea. But I mean, as you said, there is kind of like a germ of truth to it, but I wouldn't go as far to say they all did it, because, I mean, how do you really know? I mean, you weren't there.
What is it that they were doing? That's the question. What is it that they were actually doing?
Right.
One can imagine, for example, that consumption of sexual fluids in some kind of sacramental context might have made sense on this Gnostic view. The idea that instead of perpetuating the light spark, we're going to recycle it and try to almost do a kind of internal alchemy, right?
Right.
Do it first. You can imagine that might make a kind of sense, but
I guess right.
But actually figuring out what those sacramental practices look like is, unfortunately, we have to wade through all of these polemical accounts. Yeah.
Right. And this also there. I also talk. There's one text that actually goes into this. I don't know. I don't know if it actually says to sacrifice babies or anything, but I mean, I think it does get into like animal sacrifice. It's called the Greek magical papyri. Now, there's a lot of in this text. There's a lot of allusions to Gnosticism and Hermeticism, Roman and Greek gods, etc., etc. But what's your opinion on the Greek magical papyri? Like, is there any relationship to Zosimos or theurgy or Goetia? Like, what's your opinion or general opinion on those texts, the papyri?
Yeah. So most of the surviving magical papyri, I would call them Greco-Egyptian magical papyri to emphasize the Egyptian provenance of these texts. Most of them were recovered in and around Thebes. So in the neighboring vicinity of Zosimos in Panopolis.
Mm-hmm.
And they reflect a very similar kind of cosmopolitan outlook. So they're very, very interesting affinities between the kind of esotericism we find in Zosimos and the kind of esotericism that is on display in those rituals, which are drawing on all of the different religious traditions. Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Babylonian. Fundamentally, I think it's clear that the magicians, so-called magicians who wrote these papyri, were priests, were Egyptian priests. We know this because of the use of obscure scripts like Demotic and Hieratic, which were only used and read by priests. But these priests were certainly Hellenized priests, and they were drawing on a lot of different cultural traditions and blending them creatively with traditional Egyptian ritual practices. So when I think of these magical papyri, I think of them as a kind of handbook, kind of prototype of the grimoire, really, one of the earliest collections of spell books, that was used by these priest magicians, who were probably operating now. This is in the midst of the decline of the temple culture. They were probably operating now outside of the official temples, more or less as freelance ritual specialists. So those papyri do emanate from a traditional priestly context, but they also are drawing on all of the different cultural traditions that are in the mix in Upper Egypt in this period.
A lot of the magical papyri, I should say, there's a lot of allusions to like these headless daemons, and I'm not really exactly sure what that actually means. I was reading through these magical rituals that the papyri were describing, but these headless daemons are like the part of the air, and then that kind of corresponds to how the devil is described as the prince of power of the air in Paul's writings. And I think Iamblichus also talks about how these daemons exist in sort of like they're like in between our world and the divine realm. Like the daemons are like, in one sense, are like the bridge to the divine world, but at the same time they're also like the administrators or the custodials that have us enmeshed in matter, So like this idea of the daemon, like what's your opinion? Like what is a daemon really? I mean, what's your opinion on that?
Right. Yeah. In the imperial Roman period, you see the development of a very sophisticated daimonology, where typically the daimon, this is especially taking shape in Platonism, later Platonism, but then also into the Hermetic and the Gnostic traditions, which are drawing on Platonism. The daimon is, as you said, an intermediary.
Mm-hmm.
And you already see this idea of the daimon announced by Plato in the Symposium, centuries before. The idea of the daimon as a ministering spirit. But in the late antique accounts of cosmogenesis, the daimon is really a kind of personification of the ethereal energies that are radiating from the stars, right? Which serve as the conduits through which divine energies are brought into the material world below the moon. Often the daimons are associated with the moon as the lowest sphere in the celestial hierarchy. They're described as emanating from the moon in some sense, and Hecate in the Chaldean oracles is their overseer. They are described as inhabiting the upper atmosphere of the sublunar world. Some of them, they're sort of graded, right? They fall themselves into a kind of hierarchy. Some are closer to the moon and some are closer to the earth. And those that inhabit the depths of the earth, the chthonic daimons, are thought to be more unruly, more chaotic. And in authors like Iamblichus, and even earlier in Plutarch, we already see a kind of anxiety around the lower daimones. So very interesting. Like in late Platonism, there's a growing anxiety about blood sacrifice, and this concern that in blood sacrifice we might actually be nourishing these lower daimones, who are kind of malevolent. They might not be evil in a positive sense, but they definitely have a malevolent will. They're definitely chaotic and dangerous. Those chaotic daimones are very important in magic, right? So we see in the rituals of the papyri attempts to harness those unruly, chaotic forces, and it has to be done in a very strategic manner. So you'll notice that the rituals will usually appeal to heavenly gods in order to control the chthonic gods or the chthonic daimons, right? So the divine hierarchy is used as a kind of mechanism for bringing these lower daimones under our magical control. So for the purposes of curses and such like. Yeah. So the question of the daimon, its moral character, whether it's good or evil or something in between, whether it can be harnessed magically for nefarious ends, right? We see those things being explored in this period.
Right, and what's funny though, a lot of people if people who are not initiated into the subject of the magical papyri, people might think, oh, well, that's just like all black magic, blah blah blah. But the thing is, if you read, a lot of the spells are actually Christian in orientation, because where you actually like invoke the spirit of the Christos, he's a good one, and you use the spirit of Christos to kind of control other these lower daemons or daemones. And you also call the power of the Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit to control these lower aspects of our world. Right. So in a sense, these practices are also can be considered magic, quote unquote. I mean, you can call it white magic if you want to, but I mean these are practices that were engaged by early Christians. And of course, when you look at descriptions of how Jesus is described as magician, and I think it was Morton Smith who actually was the first one to actually really make that connection really heavily. He said that Jesus, a lot of his practices correspond with the magical papyri, and even Paul. We look at his writings. There's a lot of connections with the papyri as well, it kind of blew my mind when I read that. But even look at how Jesus is described as this antinomian magician in the Talmud. He's described as a heretic, and of course in the Gospels he's also treated as a heretic by the Pharisees, So yeah, Jesus is a heretic. he's a Gnostic heretic. And then, he was punished for that, for being that, and he was killed. But of course, he took that, and then according to that story, he died and he resurrected, and then he's coming back, to wage vengeance against the world. But anyway, so does Zosimos see Jesus? I know we talked about Jesus earlier, but is there any correlation between how Morton Smith described Jesus as a magician, and does Zosimos see Jesus as a magician as well, or does he? I know we talked about that earlier, but is there any connection there? I mean, maybe I'm just talking out of my ass.
Well, Zosimos doesn't discuss Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about Christ as a divine principle.
Right.
He's not really. He's in the text that we have. He doesn't speak about the human appearance or form of Christ. But again, for Zosimos, magic seems to be something pejorative, right? He thinks of alchemy. He thinks of alchemy and magic as very different types of activity. Alchemy is harmonious with nature, and magic is violent or coercive. But on this general theme, if we think about the magical papyri, which are certainly, they're being written down around the same time that Zosimos is active, right? It's definitely a neighboring tradition. And also we can note that Zosimos himself is a contemporary of Iamblichus, who references very similar Egyptian rituals to what we find in the magical papyri. So they're all part of the same mix in a wider sense. But the formula in the magical papyri for adjuration, to adjure a spirit, to bind a spirit by oath, those formulae are related to Jewish exorcistic formula, which can be found on artifacts, from Palestine, that area. These have been explored by scholars, these parallels. And, Jesus is usually connected in some way to those Jewish baptismal exorcistic, right, strains. So there's an interesting connection there, right, to exorcise a spirit, to drive a spirit out through the power of Christ, through the power of the Holy Spirit. That activity, that ritual activity, is similar to the activity of binding a spirit through the power of Christ or through the power of some heavenly principle. And this is true also for the later European grimoire tradition, right? The formulae used by ceremonial magicians in the later grimoires are always adaptations of liturgical formulae. So Richard Kiekever, in his study of the later European grimoires, noted that The Latin formulae for binding spirits, for adjuration, are just adaptations of exorcistic formulae. So that same pattern, the adaptation of orthodox rituals for magical ends, that is happening from the very beginning in the Greco-Egyptian context, all the way through the later tradition.
And now it's interesting you mentioned how magic's described as in a very negative way. Oh, well, through Zosimos. Now, if you look at the text like the Book of Enoch, it describes how these watchers of fallen angels gave mankind these gifts, these heavenly gifts of magic and sorcery, and and I notice a lot of Christians on the internet. I mean, some are really into the Book of Enoch. Some condemn it as just blasphemous heresy. It's too Gnostic, so stay away from that. But I mean, but the Bible, New Testament itself, both the Old and New Testament, refers quite a bit to the Book of Enoch. I mean, it's all over the place if you really look hard enough. It's in Jude, Revelation, Genesis. I mean, what's Zosimos' connection with the Book of Enoch?
Yeah. So in a passage that's preserved in a later Byzantine historian, we have a little fragment from Zosimos where he describes the Book of Enoch and that famous account of the watchers, the watcher angels, who were charged with overseeing beings, but who became enamored and seduced by desire for the flesh. And so in exchange for sex, these angels revealed certain divine secrets. And Zosimos is particularly interested in the reference to coloring tinctures. That's to say, arts of metallurgy and arts connecting to the coloring of base metals, which of course suggests alchemy to Zosimos. Now the thing about the Book of Enoch as a whole, and critics of it tend not to actually have read it, I don't think, because the Book of Enoch does not praise the Watchers.
Mm-hmm.
The Book of Enoch regards this revelation of occult secrets as disastrous for humans, right? These divine secrets, human beings were unprepared to wield that kind of divine knowledge, and it ended up contaminating human life. Right? It leads to the engendering of this monstrous race of giants, right? These angel-human hybrids, and all of this leads ultimately to the Great Flood. And Noah is, of course, the progeny of Enoch, right? They're genealogically connected. So Enoch is the guy who intercedes and tries to bring about some kind of, in a way, to bring out some kind of reconciliation to this unfolding drama. He's a kind of visionary figure who is he was granted a vision of God and his angels, very similar to the kind of Merkava mystical tradition surrounding Ezekiel, right? This idea of the sage who is so pure that he's allowed to see the chariot of God directly, and then becomes a prophet who returns to the world and tries to bring a kind of redeeming justice. So that kind of apocalyptic Judaism is very closely related to Sethian Gnosticism. The Gnostics definitely read the Book of Enoch. They reference it. I think there are references to it, maybe oblique references. And of course, that kind of Judaism is related to the sort of fringe Judaism of the Essenes. Right? There are many different strains of esotericism that crop up in Judaism in the wake of the destruction of the temple by the Romans, where many Jews seem to be looking for a more ecstatic, mystical relationship to God outside of the temple culture. And so Zosimos sees all of those forms of Jewish mysticism as just different expressions of the same tradition. Right? So he freely weaves those into his account. It is weird, though, the suggestion that alchemy is a revelation of fallen angels. Right? And in one of my articles, I explore, how it is that Zosimos can regard his own practices as both holy and as revealed by fallen angels, as some kind of forbidden knowledge. And I think what's at work there is just there's a kind of intuition that alchemy itself, in the hands of the uninitiated, could be something dangerous, right? Meddling with divine secrets for the inapt is a dangerous practice. There's nothing wrong with the knowledge itself. It is a question of whether we are equipped to handle that knowledge, whether we have the divine insight to wield it without destructive consequences. That's kind of where Zosimos is going. He's going with that.
Sure. And, if you look at the Book of Enoch, it describes, Christ or the Son of Man in, these very positive terms. So I wouldn't say it's blasphemy or heresy necessarily. I mean, if you look at, it talks about, the Son of Man, he's the Son of God. I mean, it's so many similarities between the Book of Enoch and the Book of Revelation too. Right. But it's also there's also connection. I think I talk about this in my book with Tracy, where I connect Hermes, Thoth with Enoch, and of course, so they're all part of this Trismegistic tradition, and of course, Trismegistus means thrice great, or they're 3 times awesome,
Yes.
I think it's almost like a magical version of the Trinity, if you really want to think about that in those terms. But anyway, go ahead. What's your opinion on that connection?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because some of the Islamic esotericists will equate Enoch or Idris, they call him Idris, with Hermes. As one, as you say, as one of the 3 Hermes, right? So this idea that the name Trismegistus is a reference to a genealogy of Hermes. This is an idea that seems to come from the Islamic Hermetic tradition, and and I think it's Abu Mashar, the astrologer Abu Mashar, who describes how the first Hermes was Idris. The primal Hermes.
Okay.
So there is a connection there, and it makes sense in as much as Hermes and Enoch are both prophetic, visionary figures. They both are granted a vision of the divine world, and then they return as prophets, right, to enlighten the masses. And that, I think, for the for the Islamic tradition, linking the pagan Hermes to Enoch is a way of bringing the pagan tradition under the ambit of the Abrahamic tradition, right? So that for the Shiite esotericists, this was a way of legitimating the study of pagan texts by showing that they really belong ultimately to the wider Abrahamic spiritual worldview.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating, just connecting all these ideas, different, would be Hermes or Adam or Thoth or Enoch or Jesus. But I guess what can we really take from Zosimos? What's his final revelation to humanity in his writing? What's the biggest thing we can take from him, and what can we learn as a species to grow spiritually?
Yeah. Well, there are 2 things I'd say about it. One is, first, if you talk about the legacy of Zosimos, we have Syriac texts attributed to him, we have Arabic texts, and we have Latin texts. And scholars, none of those texts have been well studied. So we still don't know in many cases whether these later texts are actually works of Zosimos himself, or whether they're adaptations that are attributed to him. I mean, there is so much scholarship that needs to be done on this question of actually tracing the transmission of his works. But here's an interesting thread. Panopolis was the home to other alchemists.
Mm-hmm.
So we should mention Dol Nun al-Mizri, the Sufi saint, who a 9th century figure, who according to the hagiographies of him, right, the reports of Islamic chroniclers, he's from Panopolis, and he was credited with deciphering the hieroglyphs. So there are stories about that Dol Nun was able to decipher the codes in the temples in Acme, in Panopolis, and that he was an alchemist. And soon after Dol Nun, we have another Panopolitan alchemist, Uthman ibn Suwaid, who you've heard probably of the Turba Philosophorum, the Latin alchemical collection. We think that this Latin text was actually based on a work by Uthman called the Tome of the Gathering, and there are Arabic fragments of this work that have been compared to the Latin Turba. So there is in Panopolis, there seems to have been a continuous tradition of alchemy, descending from Greco-Roman times with Zosimos through to the beginnings of Islamic alchemy in Egypt, which weaves into the Sufi and Ismaili traditions. And so that, I think, that is how spiritual alchemy, the spiritual alchemical tradition, was transmitted into the Islamic world. And so then indirectly there is an influence on the later Latin tradition. But the works of Zosimos himself do not seem to have been studied in the European tradition. The surviving manuscripts in which his works are contained only filtered into the European world in the Renaissance period, I think beginning in the 15th century or later. So they were not a big part of the later alchemical tradition directly. It was more through this mediated form, right? Through Ismaili mysticism, that the spiritual alchemy of Zosimos was communicated. Now, what's the takeaway? What's the legacy in a wider sense? Well, one of the most fascinating aspects of the work of Zosimos is the way that he weaves science and mysticism together. Right? So there's this unflinching demand in Zosimos that the work of transforming the world chemically has to be wedded to a spiritual purification. Right? So technological mastery of the world is only legitimate insofar as it is grounded in a kind of spiritual purification. So one of the takeaways of Zosimos is that he forces us to rethink where we draw the lines between technology and spirituality. And he forces us to reconsider some of our assumptions about objectivity. Right? This idea that we, as human beings, are masters of the universe, right? And that the world is there for us to transform and exploit. What Zosimos calls us to is a kind of responsibility, right? If you claim the power to transform the world, you better damn well transform yourself first. So this fundamental analogy between the outer work of alchemy and the inner work of spiritual transformation, which I think has implications not only for alchemy but for Western science, Western technology in general, and its relation to spirituality. That's one of the.
Right, and that's like one of the biggest lessons we can take away from this. We have to transform ourselves. There is a supernatural element, but of course to it, but we still have to go through that process of like turning back on the world, if you want to put that in those terms, and and just kind of forge ahead and become, in Christian terminology, more Christ-like, or you want to be, or the whole idea of like, crucifying yourself, crucifying your ego to become more spiritual. Ultimately, is probably one of the bigger goals and more noble esoteric paths, if you want to put it that way. Of course, in darker paths, and it's a little bit different. Like Thelema, it's all about you have to dissolve your personality. You have to descend to the abyss or something. You come back, but it's almost like you're. I don't know. You become like a devil in a way. It's weird. Like you're almost possessed in a way. Like, okay, you sacrifice your soul, but you come back as something that's not very pleasant. But in more noble traditions, like in Zosimos, or Gnosticism, or whatever, what have you, or Christianity, you become more. I guess you sacrifice, your lower self, or you turn back from your sins, so you repent, and then you go on that quest to receive God, or like God will receive you. But anyway, that's just my take on it. But I don't know what you think about all that.
Well, even in Thelema, there still is this fundamental pattern of death and rebirth. Even though, sometimes the law of Thelema is seen as a movement away from the paradigm of death and resurrection. Like the Aeon of Horus, I think there's still a fundamental way in which, as Crowley describes it, there has to be a fundamental transformation of the adept. As you said, ego has to die. You have to be reborn as a babe of the abyss.
Right.
And I think the question for Thelema is what that looks like. What does it look like beyond the veil? What does it look like to be reborn in this way? Well, Crowley says it has to do with attunement of your will to the universe. In a certain way, that is a very traditional idea. It just depends on how you elaborate it. What does it mean in Thelema to do your true will? How is that different from being Christ-like, for example? And it might turn out that there are some ways in which Thelema is actually quite traditional. After all, Crowley was well versed in the tradition, right? Initiated Golden Dawn. There's a kind of apocalyptic aspect to his thought that, to me, seems quite traditional. Despite the more sinister atmosphere, hysteria, a lot of it to me seems to be image. A lot of the more sinister stuff seems to be image, rather than substance. But,
well, it's definitely a subject for another podcast. I guess Thelema is not really the biggest subject here, but that's something I'll probably focus on another podcast. But anyway, now before we wrap things up, do you want to say anything about any future projects you're working on, or you want to make any specific announcements or anything like that?
I am right now considering a number of possible records. Possibly a book, finally a full-length book on alchemy. And I'm not sure exactly what the thematic angle is going to be there. Or the other possibility is I'll do more work on the Greco-Egyptian papyri. But we'll see. I'm in a kind of incubation period right now.
Yeah. I'd love to see how the results of that is. But I'd like to thank you for coming on my show, actually, the Magazine podcast. So, you're more than welcome to come back to talk about your projects, and I really wish you the best.
Thanks, Alex. That was, I think, a great discussion. I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, me too. Really interesting. Thank you so much. All right, take care.
Talk soon. Cheers.
All right, bye.
do it, 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 do it.